Have you ever considered whether living close to your children in old age is truly the best decision? What if it brings more regret than joy? For many, the idea of being near family offers comfort, a way to stay connected and supported in later years. But is it really that simple? While moving closer to your children may seem like the perfect plan, it often comes with unexpected challenges. A loss of independence, family tensions, or even feelings of being a burden. Sometimes, the very relationships you hope to nurture can become strained in ways you never anticipated. Today, I'll share 7 real-life stories of elderly individuals who learned the hard way that living near their children isn't always the blessing it appears to be. Each story offers a powerful lesson that might change the way you view your own future. Story 1. The burden of expectation. Mrs. Eleanor, a vibrant 72-year-old widow, had always been the cornerstone of her family home. After her husband passed away, she decided to move closer to her daughter, Mary, to stay connected and spend more time with her grandchildren. Eleanor dreamed of sharing small, joyful moments with the kids, reading bedtime stories, attending school plays, and watching them grow up. It seemed like the perfect way to fill the void left by her husband's absence. At first, everything felt wonderful. Mary was thrilled to have her mom nearby, and the grandchildren adored their grandmother's company. But over time, Eleanor began to notice subtle changes. Mary started calling her almost daily to help with chores or watch the kids. "Mom, can you pick up the kids from school? I have a meeting." "Mom, can you make dinner tonight? I'm too tired after work." What began as small, occasional favors turned into an unspoken expectation that Eleanor would always be available. Eleanor found herself juggling endless babysitting duties and household tasks. She loved helping her family, but the constant demands left her feeling drained. It wasn't the carefree time with her grandchildren she had imagined. It felt more like a full-time job. She even had to cancel her weekly bridge games with friends because Mary always seemed to need her at the last minute. Eleanor started to feel like her own life and needs no longer mattered. Eventually, Eleanor realized that the problem wasn't her willingness to help, it was the lack of boundaries. Living so close made it easy for Mary to rely on her without considering whether it was too much. Eleanor hesitated to speak up, fearing it might upset Mary or create distance in their relationship. But the more she held back, the more resentment began to build. She began to wonder if moving next door had been a mistake. This experience taught Eleanor a hard truth. Living close to family can blur the lines between being supportive and being taken for granted. While she loved her daughter and grandchildren deeply, she learned the importance of setting boundaries, even with loved ones. She began to prioritize her own time, gently but firmly communicating her limits. In doing so, she rediscovered the joy of spending time with her family on her own terms, rather than as an unspoken obligation. Story 2. The feeling of unwanted advice. Mr. Harold, a 75-year-old retired teacher, had always been a man of wisdom. Throughout his career, he guided countless students and raised his own children with care and discipline. When his son, James, suggested that Harold move closer to his family to spend more time with his grandchildren, it seemed like a wonderful idea. Harold imagined sharing stories of teaching his grandchildren important life lessons, and offering his years of experience to help James and his wife navigate parenthood. However, shortly after the move, Harold began to notice a disconnect. Whenever he offered advice, whether it was about managing the children's screen time or handling household finances, James would politely nod but rarely take his suggestions seriously. His daughter-in-law, Sarah, often responded with a dismissive, "We've got it covered, Harold." At first, Harold brushed it off, thinking they were just busy. But the pattern continued, and his well-meaning advice seemed to fall on deaf ears, leaving him feeling unappreciated and out of place. One evening, Harold tried to offer guidance on how to handle a temper tantrum from his youngest grandchild. James interrupted, saying, "Dad, things are different now. We don't parent the way you did." Those words stung. Harold began to feel that his decades of experience were being dismissed as outdated. The more he tried to help, the more it seemed to create tension. Living so close, he couldn't escape these moments, and he started to wonder if his presence was doing more harm than good. As the weeks went on, Harold found himself withdrawing. He stopped offering advice and began avoiding certain conversations altogether. But the silence didn't bring him peace. It only deepened his feelings of loneliness and rejection. Harold had always believed that proximity would strengthen family ties. But instead, it seemed to highlight the generational gap between him and his son's family. The closeness that he thought would foster connection was amplifying their differences. Through this experience, Harold learned a valuable lesson. While proximity can offer more opportunities for connection, it can also expose and magnify misunderstandings. He realized that his son and daughter-in-law needed space to parent in their own way, just as he had once needed with his own children. Harold began to focus on being present without offering unsolicited advice, letting his actions speak louder than words. In doing so, he found a better balance, one where he could still share his wisdom, but only when it was truly welcomed. Story 3. The loss of independence. Mrs. Leela, a 78-year-old retired nurse, had always been fiercely independent. After her husband passed away, she managed her home, finances, and daily routines with grace. However, as the years went by, small tasks like grocery shopping and maintaining her house became more challenging. Her daughter Emily urged her to move closer so she could help. Leela hesitated at first, but the thought of being near family for support sounded comforting. Once Leela moved into a small apartment just a block from Emily's house, things seemed to fall into place. Emily checked in daily, often bringing meals, running errands, and even organizing Leela's bills. At first, Leela was grateful for the help. It made her life so much easier. But over time, she began to notice a troubling pattern. She had stopped doing these tasks herself. Whenever a problem arose, her first instinct was to call Emily rather than figure it out on her own. One day, Leela realized just how dependent she had become when her TV remote stopped working. Instead of trying to fix it herself, she immediately called Emily to come over and help. It was a small thing, but it made Leela pause. "I used to handle things like this without a second thought," she reflected. Slowly, she began to see how much of her independence she had surrendered. Tasks she once did with confidence now felt overwhelming because she had grown accustomed to Emily stepping in. The loss of independence didn't just affect Leela. It began to strain her relationship with Emily. While Emily loved helping her mom, the constant demands started to weigh on her. She felt torn between supporting her mother and managing her own busy life. Leela could sense Emily's frustration, which made her feel even more helpless. What had started as a well-meaning plan for support had turned into a dynamic neither of them truly wanted. Leela learned an important lesson. Being too close to family can unintentionally erode your independence, even with the best intentions. She began making small changes, like handling her own grocery shopping, fixing minor issues at home, and finding ways to stay active in her community. It wasn't easy at first, but as Leela regained her confidence, she felt more like herself again. In the process, her relationship with Emily improved, as they struck a healthier balance between support and independence. Story 4. The clash of lifestyles. Mr. Walter, an 80-year-old retired carpenter, had always lived a simple, traditional life. He valued early mornings, home-cooked meals, and spending quiet time tending to his garden. When his son Greg encouraged him to move closer, Walter saw it as a chance to enjoy more time with his family. He imagined Sunday dinners, heartwarming conversations, and being surrounded by loved ones. However, Walter soon discovered that Greg's household operated very differently from the one he was used to. Greg and his family lived a fast-paced, modern lifestyle. Their house was always buzzing with activity. Late-night TV binges, takeout dinners, and a schedule packed with social outings. Walter, who preferred quiet evenings and a structured routine, found himself out of sync. One evening, he expressed his concern about the constant takeout meals, suggesting that Greg's wife cook more often. "Dad, we're just too busy for that," Greg replied, brushing off the comment. The small differences in lifestyle began to pile up, turning into frequent arguments. Walter would voice his disapproval when the grandchildren spent hours on their tablets instead of playing outside, and Greg, in turn, would get defensive, feeling like his father was judging how he chose to raise his family. What started as well-meaning advice from Walter often came across as criticism, and both men began to feel frustrated. Walter started to wonder if moving closer had been a mistake. Living nearby also meant there was little escape from these clashes. Every time Walter visited, he felt uncomfortable, as though he didn't belong in his son's world. Greg, too, began to feel the strain, often hesitating before inviting Walter over, knowing it might lead to another disagreement. The closeness that was supposed to bring them together was, instead, highlighting their differences and driving a wedge between them. Eventually, Walter came to understand that even within families, different lifestyles require mutual respect and space. He realized that his old-fashioned ways didn't have to align with Greg's modern habits, and that their differences didn't diminish their love for each other. Walter decided to visit less frequently, giving both himself and Greg's family the breathing room they needed. Over time, their relationship improved as they learned to focus on what mattered most, cherishing the moments they shared, despite their differences. Story 5. The guilt of watching their struggles. Mrs. Nancy, a 76-year-old retired librarian, had always been a devoted. When her daughter Laura lost her job and faced financial struggles, Nancy didn't think twice about moving closer to offer support. "I just want to be there for her," she told herself. At first, the arrangement seemed to work well. Nancy enjoyed spending more time with her granddaughter, helping with school pickups, and cooking meals for the family. But as time went on, Nancy began to see the toll Laura's financial troubles were taking on her. Nancy often overheard Laura and her husband arguing about overdue bills or unexpected expenses. The stress in their household was palpable, and Nancy felt it deeply. She started stepping in, offering to pay for groceries, utility bills, and even small luxuries like her granddaughter's dance lessons. At first, Laura resisted, saying, "Mom, you don't have to do this." But eventually, she accepted the help. Nancy told herself it was only temporary, but the requests became more frequent, and soon, Nancy was dipping into her own modest savings. The emotional strain grew heavier each day. Nancy couldn't bear to see Laura struggle, but she also began to feel overwhelmed. She worried about her own finances, wondering if she would have enough to support herself in the long run. Yet, every time Laura needed help, Nancy couldn't say no. Watching her daughter's challenges up close left her feeling helpless and guilty. "What kind of mother would I be if I didn't help?" she thought, even as she began losing sleep over her dwindling savings. One afternoon, Nancy confided in a friend, who gently reminded her that while her intentions were noble, she couldn't pour from an empty cup. "You can't solve all her problems, Nancy," the friend said. "Sometimes the best support is emotional, not financial." That conversation was a wake-up call for Nancy. She realized that her constant financial assistance was enabling Laura to rely on her rather than finding sustainable solutions. Nancy decided to step back and encourage her daughter to seek financial counseling and other resources. She learned a difficult but important lesson. Living close to loved ones can sometimes expose parents to emotional stress they can't always fix. By setting boundaries, Nancy found a healthier way to support her daughter, offering guidance and encouragement without sacrificing her own well-being. While it wasn't easy, it allowed both Nancy and Laura to grow stronger, proving that love and support don't always mean solving every problem yourself. Story 6. The unspoken competition among siblings. Mr. George, a 79-year-old retired teacher, had always prided himself on being a fair and loving father to his 3 children. When his health began to decline, his youngest daughter, Emma, urged him to move closer to her. Emma had more flexibility in her schedule and lived in a quiet neighborhood with excellent health care. George agreed, hoping it would make things easier for both of them. What started as a practical decision, however, soon turned into an unexpected source of tension within the family. George's other 2 children, James and Linda, initially supported the move, thinking it made sense for Emma to take on a more active caregiving role since she lived nearby. But as weeks turned into months, James and Linda began to feel excluded. Every time they called, George would talk about how much time he spent with Emma and her family. Linda, who lived out of state, began to feel especially hurt. "It's like Dad's forgotten about us. Everything is about Emma now," she said. The tension grew when George's birthday came around. Emma organized a small celebration at her home, but James and Linda couldn't make the trip due to work and family obligations. George expressed disappointment, which only deepened their resentment in time. James felt like he was being judged for not being as involved, even though he was helping financially. Meanwhile, Linda struggled with guilt, wondering if she should uproot her own family to be closer. The once close siblings began to argue, and George found himself caught in the middle. Over time, George realized how his decision to move near Emma had unintentionally created a sense of competition among his children. By being physically closer to one child, he had unintentionally made the others feel less valued, even though he never meant to. George decided to address the issue head-on by calling a family meeting to talk openly about their feelings. He reassured James and Linda that he appreciated all they did for him, even from a distance. He also committed to making more effort to visit them and stay connected, no matter the miles. This experience taught George an important lesson. Living near one child can unintentionally create family disputes and feelings of favoritism. He realized that maintaining strong relationships with all his children required intentional effort and communication. By addressing the unspoken competition, George was able to mend the rift and remind his family that love doesn't depend on proximity. It depends on understanding and mutual respect. Story 7. The feeling of overstaying your welcome. Mrs. Margaret, a 74-year-old retired nurse, had always been independent. However, after her hip surgery, her son Michael and his wife Sarah insisted she temporarily move into their guest house to recover. Grateful for their kindness, Margaret agreed, thinking it would only be a few months until she was back on her feet. At first, the arrangement seemed ideal. She enjoyed seeing her grandchildren every day and appreciated the support during her recovery. But as the months passed, Margaret began to sense that her presence was no longer welcomed in the same way. Subtle signs started to appear. Michael and Sarah stopped inviting her over for family dinners as often. Sarah would occasionally comment on how the guest house could be used for other things once Margaret no longer needed it. Even the grandchildren, who once eagerly ran to greet her, seemed less enthusiastic, caught up in their own activities. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer just a guest, but someone who had overstayed her welcome. The turning point came when Margaret overheard Michael and Sarah discussing their plans to turn the guest house into a home office. "We'll need to talk to Mom about finding her own place soon," Michael said, his voice hesitant. Margaret felt a pang in her chest, realizing that what she thought was a temporary arrangement had now become a burden. She began questioning whether she had misunderstood the length of her stay or if she had been too reliant on her family. Feeling hurt but determined not to create tension, Margaret decided to address the situation openly. She thanked Michael and Sarah for their support and reassured them that she would find her own place soon. Though Michael insisted she didn't need to rush, Margaret could see the relief on his face. She moved into a nearby senior apartment complex within a few weeks, a place where she could regain her independence while staying close to her family. This experience taught Margaret that, even with family, prolonged proximity can sometimes lead to discomfort and strain. While she was grateful for their help, she realized the importance of maintaining her own space and independence. Margaret's decision to move out not only restored her sense of belonging, but also improved her relationship with Michael and Sarah, reminding her that love and support often flourish best when boundaries are respected. As we've seen through these 7 heartfelt stories, living close to your children in old age isn't always as simple or ideal as it might seem. Whether it's the clash of lifestyles, the guilt of witnessing struggles, or the feeling of overstaying your welcome, proximity can come with unexpected challenges. But remember, the key is to strike a balance. Maintain your independence, communicate openly, and set boundaries that work for everyone involved. Thank you so much for watching this video and spending time with us today. If you found these stories meaningful or relatable, let us know by commenting 9 below. If you feel this topic doesn't apply to you, comment 0. We'd love to hear your thoughts either way. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos. Until next time, take care, stay wise, and continue living life to the fullest. Goodbye.